Very common question I've been getting on Twitter, comments, and live streams is just like, can't Apple do something more with the MacBook lineup, right? Because with iPhones, we got the 13, 13 Pro, 13 Pro Max, 13 Mini, and you've still got the 12 Mini hanging around. With the iPads, we got the budget one, the iPad Mini, iPad Air, 11-inch iPad Pro, 12.9-inch iPad Pro. We were used to kind of having these complicated lineups, so how come the MacBook line is basically just Air in Pro? Probably based on Apple's history of having, you know, a regular MacBook. A lot of people want that name to come back. Today's video I'll be explaining if there's really room in the lineup for a third MacBook tier, and hopefully it sheds some light on the subject. Let's begin. So yeah, don't get me wrong, I was a big fan of the original MacBooks when they were first available. I kind of dug the idea that Apple had 3 tiers, because like all good things comes in 3, right? It's like a nice even number, even though it's odd, but I don't know. It feels natural to just be like, okay, this laptop is meant for being thin and portable. This one is meant for being, you know, high-end and for the pros. And then maybe there's something in the middle that could be cheaper and kind of give you more performance than what the ultra-thin, super light laptop can give you, but it's not going to break the bank or be as heavy as the Pro line, which has heavy-duty specs and that kind of thing. If you guys haven't been living under a rock and you're aware of the Apple Silicon lineup, I think it's these next-generation chips that actually make a third MacBook in the lineup kind of difficult to understand, because Apple Silicon is so power efficient and Apple has gotten so good at making cheap devices thin that now, like, the MacBook Air, even though it starts at $1,000, has insanely good performance. It's a fanless design, but the M1 chip is still plenty fast. I would still argue overkill for most people, but I think Apple likes that. They like having like overkill performance for their entry-level super light notebook. And if you take the risk of saying, let's make an even cheaper one, maybe for the sake of trying to emulate the iPhone line, let's say they don't call it just MacBook, because that gets a little bit confusing. You have to start saying the regular MacBook or the entry-level MacBook. For the sake of the argument, let's just say they call it MacBook SE, right? Because I somewhat like this idea. Similar to how there's an iPhone SE, Apple could take like even a plastic chassis like they used to in the old MacBook days, and you know what? I would even say they could probably boot macOS off of an iPhone chip. A 15 chip is still plenty fast for a phone, and I think it would cover the basics of what most people need a Mac to do. Sure, not as fast as the M1, but I think that would be okay for the market this is catering towards. You could throw an A15 chip in there, maybe not give it the greatest battery life. Again, not very thick, you know, definitely not as fast as a MacBook Air. Maybe sell that laptop for, I don't know, $700, $600. As much from a consumer's perspective as I would love that, I'd be like, hey, great, cheaper MacBooks, right? Like, increase Apple's market share. Whenever you introduce a cheaper version of the Mac, you have to understand that is going to completely cannibalize whatever the current entry-level Mac is. So Apple's currently able to sell every MacBook Air at $1,000 plus. Occasionally the educational discount gets below that, but for the most part, $1,000 is around the entry point for MacBooks. And as soon as you lower that entry point, students, schools, universities are all going to start buying that because they know they just want something with a Mac in the name, and that's going to outsell the MacBook Air fairly quickly. So even though the MacBook Air is supposed to be this thin, light, still powerful notebook, nobody wants to buy it anymore because they're willing to put up with the thicker design if it means they can get into the Mac ecosystem and they can have a MacBook, you know, all in one device for cheaper. And the truth is, Apple has tried to bring back that regular MacBook name several times, introducing it with like the plastic design and then reintroducing it with the 12-inch MacBook, and neither time they introduced it, it really ended up sticking around. So margins as a whole, I think, would just ultimately go down on the Mac line if they started compromising on the chassis design, and if everybody just started buying $700 MacBooks instead of $1,000 MacBooks. So financially, wouldn't exactly be helpful for Apple, so I get why they're not really entering that third tier of MacBook option that we used to have. And the other issue is it's kind of hard to find something that's in between the M1 and the M1 Pro. Right now, MacBook Air starts at $1,000, and of course, many of you are probably already commenting 13-inch MacBook Pro with Touch Bar should really be looked at as the mid-tier MacBook, but maybe some of you don't like the existence of that MacBook Pro because it has the Touch Bar and it doesn't really fit in with the other bigger MacBook Pros. And there's still like a $700 gap between the M1 MacBook Pro and the M1 Pro Pro, MacBook Pro. Oh my god, Apple, why did you name it like this? So if you guys want my advice as to what they should do with another tier, I actually think this could be more simple. Instead of having a third tier of MacBook SE that's slightly thicker, because I think we've moved past the point of thinner devices are more expensive. Now I think Apple can manufacture thin devices for about the same price as the older, thicker devices. Instead of having a weird separate tier that tries to go in the middle of everything, I would suggest Apple just make a larger version of the M2 MacBook Air, which is coming out next year. That thing's supposed to be thinner and lighter than the current design, and I think it's essentially going to be the same form factor as the 12-inch MacBook, just with much thinner bezels. That way you retain the same display size as the current MacBook Air, but the keyboard goes right to the edge, so it's way more compact and it's very, very lightweight. I think along the launch of that, I'm not getting sources or anything, it would be perfect for Apple to introduce a 15-inch version of the MacBook Air, because I know a ton of people that love bigger laptops and are often in the market for getting a 15-inch or 16-inch MacBook Pro just because they want the bigger screen. They don't necessarily have a pro workflow or anything. They don't need the insane power of the M1 Pro or M1 Max, but they just want a larger sized laptop. And if this 15-inch MacBook Air was still, you know, thinner and lighter than the MacBook Pros, it could retain a lot of its portability while still having a bigger screen. Plus, with a fanless design, if you didn't have any thermals in a design that big, you could probably still stuff a fairly large, like 100 watt-hour battery and still just give it the M2 and nothing really that fancy, because this laptop is not about performance, it's about like efficiency. And with a big battery and a really, really efficient chip like the M2, you would be getting all day battery life with that thing. And I could see it being very popular while not cannibalizing the lineup, because ideally, you know, this laptop would probably start around $1,500. I don't know the individual cost of the parts that go into MacBooks, but I have a feeling that the reason they restrict the larger display to the higher end models is because the display is one of the more expensive components. So maybe the 15-inch MacBook Air is like $1,600 or $1,700, but it would still be cheaper and undercutting the 14-inch model and not eating into the sales of the Pros, because the M2 is not rumored to be faster, just more efficient, slightly better graphics than the M1, but M1 Pro and M1 Max will still have their place. I think that would be like the perfect middle tier to add to this lineup, but do you guys think it makes sense to have like a whole separate tier MacBook SE, like, I don't know, with like a heavily binned M1 Pro so that it's faster than the Air but not as fast as a Pro, and it's just thicker, and for some reason because it's thicker that means it costs less to make or something like that? I don't know. But I personally think with Apple Silicon being so efficient, it kind of just makes sense to have two major product lines. MacBook Air, which is iconic and recognizable, and MacBook Pro, also very iconic and recognizable. I think that if it weren't for the Pro on the one touch bar MacBook in the lineup, nobody would be buying that thing, because the M1 with a fan, really not much faster than a regular M1 in a MacBook Air. I really just think people buy it because they hear Pro. Okay, it's a Pro, that means it must be faster. If you check those speed tests, very, very negligible differences. But feel free to let me know your guys' opinion on the MacBook lineup, and what do you think it needs? What is it missing? Or do you think it's perfect in the way it is right now? That's fine too. Feel free to let me know down below. This is your Apple Sheep here. I'll see you guys in the next one.